Hi, I'm always happy to come to the studio school and speak because, after all, you do what I only talk about. And it was the first place I ever went to see real artists paint when I was a high school student in New York. My painting teacher, Vida Peterson, who is still involved with the school, brought me down here to hear Louis Finkelstein give a crit to the first-year students. So it was my first major experience with real people who were painting. So I always have happy memories of this place. Today I'm going to speak about a subject that surprisingly is not addressed in the literature of the history of art, and that is the subject of a painter's explorations into a different medium, in this case photography. Before I plunge into the specifics of the particular relationship of photography to painting and the work of Vuillard, I think it might be a good idea to place Vuillard for you in his milieu at the end of the 19th century in Paris. He was born in 1868, a year before Matisse. But Vuillard's reputation is based on works created a full decade before Matisse's first fauve paintings of 1905. They actually began in similar veins. And the first two slides, can I have them? On the left, you see a Vuillard still life from 1889, and on the right, a Matisse still life from 1896. Matisse's still life was painted 7 years after Vuillard, but by 1891, Vuillard was painting this still life of lilacs, which presented a much more radical approach to the subject than Matisse would address for many years to come. And I might add that this little still life of lilacs, which was actually in the same collection in New York as this one of daffodils, the lilacs was just sold last Monday night at Sotheby's in the breakup of one of the great collections that was formed before the war in New York. And it was a collection I knew actually quite well. And I knew the lilacs quite well as well, but was amazed at Sotheby's to see once again with what limited means Vuillard could create a masterpiece. And those lilacs were not even, it was barely 12 inches by 10 inches, the painting. And yet, to me, what was truly poetic, and I'll just jump off and show you, was that this little triangle in almost the center of the composition was raw cardboard. It was something that was not touched at all by paint, and around which the whole composition sort of revolved. That is, my work on Vuillard actually is concentrated as much on what he chose not to paint as what he chose to paint. And the other thing that I found mesmerizing about this painting was how he took the end of his paintbrush and just scratched through the wet paint right down there. So in something that seemed kind of static and flat, really, with one gesture, gave you a tremendous vitality. And I'm happy to say I know the person who bought the painting, and it's in a really great Vuillard collection that hopefully someday will be on public view. So it's not lost forever to God knows where. Although Vuillard's exploration of color and form resulted in some of the most radical self-portraits painted, and I show you this self-portrait from 1892, Matisse would only begin to approach this freedom in his art a decade later. And I'm showing you the portrait of Madame Matisse, the green stripe, from 1905. But this is not a lecture about Vuillard and Matisse. Rather, I thought it might be helpful to have Vuillard placed, so to speak, in the generation before the radical art of the 20th century. Though Vuillard lived for 4 decades into this century, his most adventurous expressions were those of a 19th century painter with a 19th century sensibility. He was inspired in subject by the great Impressionists who were a generation older than he. And yet, if you look at paintings by Vuillard entitled The Vuillard Family at Dinner from 1890 and compare them to Impressionist paintings of family scenes, and I just show you a Monet of Camille Monet and her cousin on the beach from 1870, you will see that the style of Vuillard's compositions is totally different from the Impressionist embrace of direct observation. But a different comparison of the same artists illustrates a different point. And I show you Monet's Doge's Palace, which is actually in the collection of the Brooklyn Museum, and Vuillard on the right, a landscape from 1895. When you compare Impressionist pictures to Symbolist ones, you should be aware of two things. The aims of the two schools were basically different. Monet and Vuillard share a fascination with geometric divisions of the compositions. In the Monet, the rectangular form of the palace, though horizontal, makes a vertical rectangular continuum when seen with its forceful reflection. Similarly, Vuillard divides the simple landscape into 3 horizontal bands that, when combined with the sky above, form an almost abstract composition. And yet Monet pays more attention to the effect of the sun hitting the building and the water, and Vuillard reduces the image of the landscape almost to an idea. The second thing you should keep in mind when thinking about this period in the history of art is that there is no set chronology of one movement preceding another. In fact, the Monet was painted about 10 years after the Vuillard, and the abstract patterning in the Impressionists' composition could easily even have been inspired by Vuillard. Vuillard sought a more imaginative interpretation of nature, inspired by the art and thinking of the great post-impressionists, George Seurat, Vincent van Gogh, and Paul Gauguin. He toyed briefly with the pointillism of Seurat, and I show you 2 portraits of his grandmother, which, though they take the dots from Seurat, are clearly somewhat different from Seurat's poudreuse, where the dots sort of decompose into optical illusions, and this becomes a much more mysterious, evocative kind of picture. And you might be able also to see some influence in Van Gogh's poignant self-portraits. I show you again the octagonal self-portrait and a self-portrait of Van Gogh, which show basically a lozenging of the dots of paint, perhaps inspired by Seurat, or certainly Seurat or Van Gogh, forming in both cases a halo-like effect around the image of the artist. But it was their departure from reality and their embrace of a symbolic evocation of ideas that was really the bond that Vuillard shared with them. Gauguin, of all the post-impressionists, was the most inspirational to Vuillard, encouraging him and his fellow painters to paint nature as their imagination dictated. There's a famous quote recounted by Vuillard's friend Paul Serozier that Gauguin had said to him in front of a landscape: "If you see a tree as yellow, paint it the yellowest yellow on your palette. If you see the ground is red, paint it your most vivid red." This liberated him from the constraints of having to follow academic prescriptions of how to paint and freed him to draw from his imagination. By the time Vuillard painted his first mature works in about 1890-91, the generation of the great post-impressionist artists had all but vanished. Van Gogh died in 1890 and Seurat the following year. Gauguin was in Tahiti by then, only returning to France briefly in 1894 before returning to the tropics. A new generation would take its place, among which the Nabi, and I don't know but if you know this, but the word means prophet in Hebrew, as these artists were supposed to be prophets of a new art, would be among the most notable groups of this generation, and Vuillard and Bonnard the most famous participants. You should keep in mind as I deliver this lecture that we are seeing the painted works of an artist who is being encouraged by his mentors and peers to depart from an objective depiction of reality to a symbolist one. And yet at the same time, we're going to be looking at the photographs he took. Photography was clearly supposed to offer a scientific view of reality, one objectively true. How Vuillard reconciled his symbolist painting to this seemingly irrefutable, truthful means of reproducing the world is the subject that I would like to address now. Vuillard's photographs pose questions about deliberation and accident, about the subjectivity of his vision and the objectivity of the camera, about the empirical reality and mystical evocation that are at the core of meaning in his art. I will focus in this talk on the consistency of Vuillard's photographic and pictorial vision. I want to concentrate on his early photographic experimentation in relationship to his paintings of the same time. This is a photograph of Vuillard taken by Bonnard in 1900. We see him holding his Kodak, standing in repose in the garden at Bonnard's country property. Another photograph by Bonnard records a trip that he took to Venice with Vuillard and the painter Xavier Roussel, Vuillard's brother-in-law, in 1899. These photographs not only document Vuillard with his handheld Kodak, but also reveal the occasions which Bonnard chose to record. On the left, we see an afternoon in the country being committed to film. On the right, we see a special trip in which Bonnard, like any good tourist, wants to record his friends in front of a famous monument. That Vuillard holds a camera in both pictures indicates that he too was recording these events. But although these scenes took place out of doors, Vuillard, as opposed to his friend Bonnard, concentrated on interior shots. Bonnard only concentrated on photography from about 1898 to 1907, while Vuillard, the more avid photographer of the two, took pictures all his life. Bonnard, whose paintings of the 1890s, like those of Vuillard, were mainly interior scenes, has only 2 photographs of interiors known to exist today, among hundreds of outdoor shots. Vuillard, on the other hand, was more consistent in his photographic experimentation and his painted work. The only time that Vuillard's photography has been discussed, it was mostly in terms of how closely related some paintings were to his photographs. He did mention in his journal in the 1920s that he worked with a photograph and a pastel for a painting. But there is only one instance in which we can really see that a painting was based on the photographs that were used as studies for it. And you can see how exact this truly is. I guess this needs to be focused on the left. In that the haystack and the 2 outside figures are almost exact transcriptions, even to the way the light falls, especially if you see that arm on the lady on the right. Now, where did he get the central figure from? Another photograph. You see the guy up there with the hat. And again, it's an almost exact transcription. The way the leg comes forward is fairly accurate. But the relationship, this is contrary to my point, the relationship between Vuillard's paintings and photographs is far more complex than the example cited here. The subtle deformations of the photographic space bear striking resemblance to Vuillard's painted compositions, and it is this more complex relationship that I will concentrate on this evening. Of course, people don't come here to speak of simple things. On the left, we see a photograph by Vuillard of his mother and friend, Romain Coulouse, from about 1905. And on the right, I'm showing a painting of 2 women dated 1893. The photograph which you see on the left, taken almost a decade after the painting, reveals a similar aesthetic and pictorial construction. Although I will discuss this in detail later on, it's important to note here that the foreground figures loom large and dominate the composition, while the rear figures are reduced in size. This was a characteristic of the photographic lens. This phenomenon is evident in Vuillard's photographs, though it's not been identified as a source for the disturbing distortions of space in his painted work. Vuillard would have observed strong cutting diagonals and flat areas of color in Japanese prints. This is not to imply, however, that Vuillard did not distort his pictorial space until he began experimenting in photography. On the contrary, Vuillard would have welcomed these distortions of the photographic lens as a reinforcement of what he had already achieved in painting. Although Vuillard does make constant reference to picture taking, most often quick references, he rarely, if ever, describes in detail what would constitute a photo session. The only description of Vuillard's approach to picture taking, recounted by his nephew in a 1963 catalog, is as follows. And what I haven't yet said is the Kodak was only invented in 1888. So what you were looking at is one artist's embrace of what everybody was running to experiment with. It was the most exciting, radical thing that had happened for a long time, because contrary to the bulky equipment that had been needed before, this was actually something you could hold in your hands. This is the description of how Vuillard would take his photographs. Vuillard owned a camera, a Kodak. It was an ordinary model, one of the bellows type. It was part of Vuillard's household. Its place was on the sideboard in the dining room. Sometimes, during a conversation, Vuillard would go and get it, and resting it on some furniture or even the back of a chair, oblivious to its viewfinder, would point the lens in the direction of the image he wished to record. He would then give a brief warning, "Hold it, please," and we would hear the click-clack of the time exposure. The camera was then returned to its place, and Vuillard walked back to his seat. When the number 12 appeared on the little red window of the camera, Vuillard took it to his usual supplier to have it reloaded. The printing of the film was then entrusted to his mother. Sitting by the window, overlooking the square, doing some embroidery, she watched the frame exposed to the light, and when it was time, she proceeded to the fixing in a soup plate. Because of slow shutter speeds and a rudimentary technology of focus, the photographs of Vuillard's interiors had to be as carefully composed as his paintings. The capabilities of the handheld pocket model Kodak were limited, and understanding of how the camera worked is crucial to being able to comprehend how and why Vuillard took the pictures he did. The Kodak used roll film, but only had a fixed focus, which is why the object in the center of Vuillard's composition appears in focus, while the other objects fade in relationship to their proximity to the center. Typically, the camera had a slightly wide-angle lens so that disparities in focus would be reduced. To reduce the fall-off at the edge of the image, the apparatus that Vuillard used had only one f-stop available. The result was what is referred to as hyperfocal image. There was only one possibility for perfect focus in the center of the lens. When used outside, the exposure time ranged from a 15th to a 30th of a second. But the interior shot, so central to Vuillard's concern, would have used a time exposure by which the photographer pushed a button that activated a simple mechanism incorporated in the shutter and then closed the shutter at his own discretion. Thus, the exposure time for an interior shot could and probably did last for several minutes. The only other 19th century painter whose interest in photography has been explored is Edouard Degas, and I show you a photograph by Degas of himself in the foreground and the sculptor Bartholomé. Degas and Vuillard's common interest in picture taking thus adds another link to the chain of connections between these two artists who were such careful observers of the quotidian aspects of their life and times. The brooding intimacy of some of Degas' paintings has often been reflected in Vuillard's intricate canvases, and because of the texture of their paint application and their similar compositional devices, the younger artist has often been seen as the heir of the older master of Impressionism. Degas, who became interested in photography as early as 1884, seems to have preferred the more antiquated means of picture taking with tripod, glass plates, and long exposures, even after the advent of the handheld Kodak. Like Degas, whom he so admired, Vuillard tended to avoid the instantaneity, which was the chief feature offered by the Kodak, and preferred the more awkward theatrical tableaux that were the domain of a tripod and glass plates. While Degas deliberately used more antiquated photographic machinery, Vuillard employed the modern handheld Kodak, but in the recherche manner of the older artist. There are nonetheless several significant differences in both approach and control between the photographic forays of these two artists because of the different apparatus each employed. And this gets a little technical, but bear with me. I think it helps to understand the different results. In a view camera of the kind that Degas used, the photographer focused through the lens. This method held out the possibility of very precise focusing, so the artist's selective attentions in his compositions are worthy of note. Quite a different story applies to Vuillard. Something that has not yet been mentioned in discussions of his photography is that a Kodak could not produce a precision image. The artist could not look through the lens to frame the picture. Instead, the photographer held the camera at stomach height and looked to the top of the apparatus where an arrow helped direct it to a desired object. Not only was it impossible to focus in a late 19th century model Kodak, but it was not even possible to see the image that the camera was going to capture. Why then did Vuillard choose to use a Kodak for his interior shots? It was a device that incorporated the element of accident, since neither the central object, which would have been in clear focus, nor the borders of the composition could be predetermined. The accounts of Degas' deliberately staged compositions and dramatic use of artificial light, where his subjects had to hold their poses for long periods of time, might also be true for Vuillard's interior shots, but in a different way. The time exposure of the Kodak when taking a picture of an interior would be at the photographer's discretion, but could last for several minutes. However, where Degas could focus the lens and look through it to frame his image, Vuillard could do neither. A contemporary account of Degas' picture making gives us a clue to the complex processes involved. Degas closed out the sources of natural light by drawing the curtains, moving lamps, changing reflectors, and forcing his friends to hold their poses for up to a quarter of an hour. Paul Valéry's inscription on the margin of Degas' photograph of Renoir and Mallarmé, which I show you on the left, mentions the use of 9 oil lamps and a fearful quarter hour of immobility for the subjects. So deliberate was the staging that Mallarmé came close to being burned, for Valéry continues, and I quote, "The execution was torture for the model, endured with all the grace in the world, nearly glued to a stove, roasting without daring to complain. The result was worthy of a martyr." Degas' photograph of Renoir and Mallarmé shows them posed in front of a mirror that reflects the camera Degas, and the poet's wife and daughter. And I just better point that out. Here's the camera. Here's Degas, which I'll explain later. And here's Mallarmé's wife and daughter. I also showed this again. It may be a better slide the second time. The 9 petrol lamps illuminate the area to such an extent that Degas' face in the reflection is obliterated by the glare, as you can see. Similar in composition to Degas' photograph, a photograph of Madame Vuillard and Paul Sérusier depicts Vuillard's mother standing behind the painter, who is resting his arm on the mantel. In the Degas, all the elements of the composition are sacrificed to the two figures. There are few distracting details. But in the Vuillard, all the elements of the room come into play. The ceiling molding, the pictures on the wall, the mantelpiece, and the objects resting on it. The figures appear much like an added element in the still life, except that Madame Vuillard, who has moved, is almost erased by the camera's inability to record her movement. It is her very blurriness that holds the viewer's attention. Her evanescent form is in contrast to the solid, heavy presence she commands in Vuillard's painted depictions of her, and you can think of the Vuillard of his mother and sister at the Museum of Modern Art in that regard. Yet in both media, she seems to hold the center stage. The Impressionist works with the medium in an empirical way. It can be manipulated and controlled. With Vuillard, there's an element of mystery, of chance, and of intuition. The paradox is that the more scientifically advanced apparatus actually allowed for less control. Nonetheless, he chose to use this instrument, which allowed these uncontrollable and yet characteristically symbolist elements to come to play in his work. Mirrors play an important role in the photographs and were also of crucial importance to Vuillard as he evolved into a mature artist. And these are both self-portraits of Vuillard. The whole mirror and its trompe-l'oeil surrounding constitute a pseudo-frame for the picture on the left. As you can see, the bamboo is the mirror frame and it's painted, and this is the actual frame of the picture. And it's alluded to on the right, as you see in the allusion to the bamboo. Vuillard's oeuvre is really like a code language, and the more images one knows, the easier it is to break the code, like the fact that Vuillard paints both of these portraits looking into the same mirror in the same room. References to mirrors become more abstract in Vuillard's portrait of himself and his friend Vauquy, which is actually at the Met, where the only reference to a mirror is in the reflection of the bottle on the bottom. It's sort of blurry. I don't know if you can see it. By the time Vuillard paints this self-portrait on the right, he no longer needs to make reference to a mirror because he has fully entered his imagination. Of course, the irony of self-portraiture is that while the artist may know himself better than anyone else he paints, he must rely on a mirror to convey the image of himself. Vuillard himself said, quote, "A thing remarkable in museums and in the history of painting, the more mystic painters are, the more vivid their colors, reds, blues, yellows. In a paradoxical way, the most evocative image of Vuillard is when he has left the mirror behind." Mirrors also play a role in one of Vuillard's most complex photographs, which depicts his mother and Lucy Hessel, his dealer's wife, and the artist's companion from 1900 until his death in 1940, seated from across each other in a salon. I show it to you there. The psychological, tell me if it's in focus though, I think actually it's as good as you can get. The psychological intensity of this photograph is as complex as that of his paintings and demonstrates Vuillard's achievement of his symbolic structure in both paint and film. Whereas Degas' role in the photograph of Renoir and Mallarmé is clearly evident, we see him in the reflection, Vuillard's presence in this picture is only felt and implied, but neither explained nor revealed. The two ladies sit across from each other at a seemingly intimate, convivial distance. There is no evidence of an object, even a table, between them. Madame Hessel looks directly at Vuillard with an expression of calm possessiveness. His mother, in the foreground of the photograph, though seen from behind, is completely dwarfed by Madame Hessel's imposing presence and further reduced in stature by the visual weight of Madame Hessel's feather hat. Madame Vuillard, in turn, gazes somewhat benevolently upon her sitting partner, but her warmth is not returned. The only way that the two figures are connected is through the one person who is invisible in the picture, the artist himself. The addition of a mirror above the mantelpiece to the right of Madame Hessel and above Madame Vuillard's head only further complicates the space as the two mirrors reflect totally different aspects of the room. Can you see that second mirror on the right above the mantel? Vuillard's presence is felt to a far greater extent in the mirror on the left because the sitters are reflected here and also because this is the obvious source of light. The back wall reflected on the left is highly illuminated, whereas the one on the right is in shadow. The drama of this photograph certainly represents in microcosm what must have been a stressful relationship between the two great women of Vuillard's life. In absenting himself visually, he reveals his true irreplaceable nature of his presence in the lives of these two women. At times, there are striking compositional parallels between the artist's paintings and photographs of the same subject. A photograph of Messiaen and Thaddée Nantasson from 1898 demonstrates many traits which Vuillard would continue to explore in both photography and painting for the next decade. The photograph reveals Thaddée in the foreground, looming large across the picture plane, a bit out of focus because of his proximity. In the distance, Messiaen sits in a chair in the back wall, right there. Although much smaller than Thaddée in the photograph, Messiaen nonetheless remains its focal point. Thaddée forms a weighty curve from the upper right to the lower left, in the arms of which, so to speak, the viewer can focus on the clearer image of Messiaen. A painting by Vuillard of the same subject from around the same time reveals the couple in the same room with their positions reversed. Messiaen takes up the entire foreground and middle ground, while Thaddée is pushed to a small section in the upper right-hand corner of the canvas. Messiaen, stretched in a serpentine curve in her armchair, eyes closed in an inner reverie, shares the viewer's space. Thaddée is pushed behind the piano, a small form further reduced by the actual scratching of the end of the paintbrush to erase his facial features. Although not depicted in any of the paintings or photographs discussed so far, Vuillard nonetheless makes his presence felt. In both photographs and paintings, Vuillard expresses his feelings for Messiaen, a relationship he described as, quote, having the security and assurance of a perfect understanding. By scratching out her husband, Vuillard depicts in paint the subtleties of a relationship he reflected on in his diary after having just left them on Christmas Eve, 1896. Quote, Thaddée and his wife, a very good time. Tenderness, desires of work, ambitions and sensualities, home at 4 a.m, slept until noon. Uncertainty and conflicting desires, an abundance of memories. No object blocks the connection between Messiaen and Vuillard, while in the photograph of Lucy Hessel and Madame Vuillard, his more complicated role in their lives is indicated by their glances, each of which seems directed to him, though he remains invisible to the viewer. Vuillard goes one step further in the dialogue between photography and painting by posing Lucy Hessel several years later in a way similar to Messiaen's position in the painting on the right. She too is stretched out on a chair, eyes closed, in much the same way as Messiaen, and one is encouraged to ponder whether this was the artist's way of appropriating the intimacy of the pose for the woman who had supplanted Messiaen in his affections. One important distinction between painting and photography is that in the latter, while the focus of the lens is not uniform, the distortion of the photographic lens is. In paintings, the artist can control the deformities of light, space, and focus to suit his purpose. Thus, we can observe in the photograph of Messiaen Thaddée that Vuillard manipulates the camera to focus on her, and that the light source is often used to emphasize this point. In the photograph of the couple in their salon, the light source shines directly on Messiaen's face and directs the viewer's gaze to her profile. Even if other areas of the composition, such as Thaddée's newspaper and face, are also strongly lit, they are nonetheless obscured because they are out of focus. This remains true in other pictures of the couple. She is consistently in the center of each picture, and thus the center of the photographic lens. Given the limited ability of the camera to focus, Vuillard's photographed compositions must be seen as deliberate, with the placement of Messiaen not only in the center of the lens, but with the camera at a proper distance from its main subject. Yet when painting the same subject, the artist manipulates his surroundings to a far greater extent. He bathes his primary subject in full light and depicts legibly all the other elements of the room that her body faces. Everything behind her, which constitutes the area where her husband stands, is obscured either by scumbling or scratching and the use of muddy tones. Vuillard's focus as a painter can be much more selective than when he maneuvers the camera lens. In order to emphasize Misia's centrality to the painting, he depicts only her torso and head clearly and leaves the rest out of focus. Similar compositional traits are evident in the photograph of Lucy Hessel, where her face and upturned neck are in perfect focus and the rest of her body is less clearly defined because it is bathed in light. Vuillard's focus on Misia in both paintings and photographs is consistent with his treatment of other important figures in his life. And then I show you again his photograph of his mother and Romain Coulouse. Madame Vuillard sits at a table in the foreground with her chin resting in her hand. She does not look at the photographer, but stares somewhat reflectively into space. Behind her, barely visible, is the head of Vuillard's friend Romain Coulouse, seen in profile, book in hand, but looking at Vuillard. Can you see him? He's right there. The photograph recalls several characteristics of Vuillard's paintings, such as the complex interweaving of light and dark, a foreground that looms large with a background that appears dramatically reduced in size, and a psychological interaction between the sitters and the artist, which further interweaves the spatial and compositional configurations. Absent color, the composition appears to be arranged according to a staccato play of lights and darks. Vuillard's mother, in profile at the table in the foreground, wears a light skirt and a dark satin shirt, which in itself makes lush dark and light patterns from the folds in the sleeve. She sits in a dark wood table on top of which rests, to the extreme right of the frame, a large light-colored lamp. It is only when the small distant lamp is observed that the viewer apprehends the presence of Coulouse's profile in the back of the picture. Sitting right beneath the tiny lampshade, dwarfed by the monumental figure of Madame Vuillard, Coulouse, when once perceived, plays an important compositional role in the photograph. His profile points in the same direction as Madame Vuillard, thus making an interesting parallel as her face is bathed in light and her stature within the composition is imposing. Coulouse, on the other hand, is barely perceptible and only slightly illuminated by an unseen source of light. Just as Madame Vuillard figures large in this composition, so does the lamp on the same picture plane. Coulouse's presence is diminutive, as is the lamp directly behind him. Yet in neither case does the lamp we associate with the figure actually constitute the source of light. The book or pad of paper Coulouse is holding is perhaps illuminated by the lamp behind him, but is more likely the subject of some illumination from where Vuillard is standing. If one recalls that Degas manipulated 9 petrol lamps to create his composition of Renoir and Mallarmé, one must assume that Vuillard went to similar efforts here to emphasize his chosen subjects. Degas' efforts to photograph in the dark were deliberate. As he explained to his printer Tassé, quote, "I'm trying to photograph practically night itself." While Coulouse is small in size, his presence is nonetheless emphasized by the fact that his gaze is directed to Vuillard and thus the viewer. As a result, the small, obscure elements of the background are brought compositionally back into the foreground. The exaggeration of foreground and extreme reduction of the background was a distortion of the photographic apparatus of the time, but Vuillard often used the same compositional device in his paintings of the 1890s and the early years of the 20th century. And I show you again the woman in blue from 1893. The size of the foreground figure obscures almost entirely the small figure in the background. Can you all see the small figure? You want me to point it out? Specific compositional devices, such as the ledge which the foreground figure's hand points to, and the table which leads from this, guide the viewer's eyes to the background figure. But the pictorial construction is essentially the similar between the two pictures. And here I show you Degas' absinthe drinker, which, if you look at the two pictures, must have been in Vuillard's mind when you see the same transition from foreground to background via the tables. In the flowered dress, the viewer's eyes bounce from right to left, from the large image of the woman in the foreground to her small reflection in the mirror in the background, right here, which maintains a constant tension in the work. Vuillard achieves the same tension in his photographs, but can manipulate space, color, and the inconsistencies of focus, which are his painter's license, to achieve a greater visual tension in his works on canvas. Vuillard's place in the picture remains to be addressed. In his paintings, Vuillard is a paradoxical observer. Although he portrays the most intimate of scenes, he sets up blocks that prevent the viewer, and therefore Vuillard himself, from actually entering the space. Yet Vuillard's presence, if ever felt, seems always to be evanescent. In a photograph of Vuillard's family at the table, the artist hides in the doorway. Do you see him? Up here. There he is. Much the way he does in his earliest depictions of his family at the table. I showed you. This is also in the Museum of Modern Art, but they never show it. Up there is where he's hiding. Vuillard created these two images many years apart, yet the artist's conception of himself remains consistent across media and time. Sometimes, however, Vuillard appears to have taken an unstaged photograph. This unpublished picture shows Vuillard's mother at the stove, cooking with the help of a servant. I think it might be able to be focused just a little bit. It seems as though light is pouring in through the window, obliterating Madame Vuillard's form and features to a certain extent. But like Vuillard's painted or lithographic depictions of his mother in the kitchen, physiognomy is never what Vuillard sought to reproduce. And I show you his cuisinière from his lithographic series, Paysage et Intérieur. Here we see a lithograph of Madame Vuillard in the same kitchen, drying a dish. Like images of her sewing, she is completely absorbed in the task at hand. Vuillard creates a mood in both works. Like Edmond Duranty's maxim for a new modern approach to painting, where painters were supposed to evoke a mood by means of a gesture or pose, Vuillard eschews traditional means of portraiture to create an evocative image of his mother. She is neither photographed nor painted in a grand environment, but rather in her home, doing her everyday chores. This, to Duranty, Baudelaire, and Mallarmé, was the proper intention of modern painting. At times, Vuillard would take elements from a larger tableau and devote a small picture to this selective vision. Oh, is there a bulb problem? Okay. Well, we can look at this. This is at Yale, at the Yale University Art Gallery. Here we see the kitchen with its still identifiable blue and white tile. But the painting shows only the smallest sliver of the room, the pot hanging from the hood, much as it does in the photograph, which you can no longer see, is in the painting a large, abstracted, curvilinear shape. And then my climactic photograph comes next, so I'm going to wait. We can all fan ourselves. Did you remember the number? No, well, okay, that's my next photograph. That was the climactic photograph. Anyway, as you look at this, you can see that where this pot becomes translated as that abstract round shape in the upper right. Still more ephemeral is Vuillard's appearance as a shadow in two photographs. On the left, in a picture he took of his niece, Annette Roussel, and on the right, in a picture of Bonnard with two young girls. In the amazing picture of his niece, he allows his silhouette to follow the form of the little girl who lies on the ground. The shadow of Vuillard's triangularly pointed hat not only fills the void in the foreground of the composition and points the viewer in the direction of this little girl, but also parallels the shape of her smaller version of the same hat. While Vuillard made his presence felt, but left it implicit in the photograph of his mother and Madame Hessel, here he offers his silhouette as a shadow. So typical of his concomitant presence and distance from his subjects, his shadow best expresses his involvement with his friends and family, who were the subject of his art. He is omnipresent, but as André Gide said of Vuillard, quote, he speaks in a whisper suitable to confidences. Vuillard clearly had an interest in photography that extended far beyond mere recording. He not only depicts similar subject matter in his paintings and photographs, but also portrays his subjects in similar ways. For example, in At the Window, Vuillard's sister Marie is depicted as a benevolent shadow watching over little Annette, who leans over the windowsill. Can you see the large shadow? A figure on the right. The shadow is common to both the painting and photograph, and each depicts a similar theme. In his photographs, Vuillard uses the focus of the lens to concentrate the viewer's attention, while in his painting he employs a similarly selective focus and scale. In his work on canvas, he further manipulates the image by scumbling the paint and varying the value, tone, and hue of the colors to create his desired effect. The consistency of compositional approach in Vuillard's paintings and photographs also reveal an enduring attitude toward his craft. The last issue to be addressed is the relationship between the symbolic structure of Vuillard's painted and photographic oeuvre. If photography only depicted the reality of what existed, how can this be reconciled to Vuillard's affinity to symbolism? By the late 1890s, various artists and photographers' experiments in the medium had pressed it beyond the objective depiction of reality that was, at least in certain circumstances, its primary goal. Indeed, the differences in choice of apparatus and thus the different resulting approaches to picture taking between Degas and his view camera and Vuillard and his Kodak say a lot about the different aims for which they strived in their art. Degas could control what he captured on film by what he saw through the lens, and he could determine the object of his focus. Vuillard's photographs with his Kodak allowed him control over neither of these elements, and therefore left the final result to be determined only when his mother had finished fixing the negative in the soup plate in the window. One is left to surmise that either Vuillard compensated for the lack of control of the camera with a rigid control over his subjects and the composition that he wanted to create, or that it was precisely that element of mystery that made photography so compelling to him. His manipulations of composition and focus in the photographs make for a complicated relationship among all the parts of the work, as well as between the viewer and the subjects in the piece. And his concentration on gesture, as opposed to physiognomy, create in both his photographs and his paintings a feeling and a spirit rather than a description of the people he portrayed. Whereas on one level, the photographs can be viewed as depicting a non-symbolist recreation of reality. The painter, both through his own eyes and through that of the camera lens, creates an environment where the very act of taking the picture and the interrelationship of the parts in the tableau make for a more symbolic whole. But in the end, fascinated though he was with the magical science of photography, Vuillard himself concluded that, quote, painting would always have the advantage over photography by being done by hand. While in his photographs, Vuillard used elements in the composition itself, such as mirrors, as well as the distortions of the photographic lens, to their greatest advantage, it is with a brush and paint that he best expresses the complex nature of his symbolic structure. Nonetheless, his photographs shed light on the consistency of his vision and enable us to better understand the deliberateness of his pictorial construction. Thank you.